to talk now about a lot of the debt that African nations have accumulated. Its debt load has increased sharply in recent years, equivalent to about 60% of annual economic output. And a report from the International Monetary Fund is saying that the amount of debt that African nations owe could increase by another 10% over the coming 5 years. This has been the subject of a conference that's been taking place in Ghana. We're going to talk now to one of the participants, Professor Georgie Sakata from SOAS, the University of London, also Secretary to the Executive Committee of the International Development Economics Associates. Thanks so much for joining us. Just to tell us briefly which countries are most indebted.
Thank you very much for having me on this program. So the meeting is taking place in Accra, and Ghana is one of the countries which are most debt distressed, as is Zambia. They've both defaulted on their debts. But this is a problem which concerns at least 19 African countries. South Africa has debt problems, Kenya, Nigeria, basically at least 19 African countries are debt distressed, and many more are not following far behind.
Yeah, you mentioned that Ghana and Zambia have defaulted on their debt. That is, just so everybody's clear, it means that they couldn't afford to pay them back, and there are now international efforts to try to reduce the amount of debt they owe. Is that the solution for the other countries? Is it to get those nations, those international institutions that lent these countries money in the first place, just to write off a portion of that debt?
That definitely could be one of the solutions, but our meeting wants to go far beyond that. It wants to discuss why it is that African countries and many global South countries have cyclical debt issues. And it's important to understand this so as not to keep on repeating this cycle of debt and debt forgiveness every decade or so. And we are drawing attention, therefore, to the structural factors that make African countries susceptible to indebtedness and debt distress. And the first one has to do with structural factors, the fact that African countries are dependent on export commodities, which have this cycle of boom and bust. There are times when prices collapse, and so governments cannot take care of business. We are also drawing attention to the problems of the recent pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic meant that governments had to borrow to support their COVID measures. And also the war in Ukraine raised commodity prices that African countries import for food. And also that these days, much of the money is owed to private creditors who are who charge more for debt. And so this combination of factors has created a perfect storm. We also are drawing attention to the international financial architecture, which protects creditors and basically does not look out for debtors. And many debtors have to face these more powerful and more organized creditors one by one and get picked off. We are interested in drawing attention to those factors that have to change.
Yeah, and Kenya's president, William Ruto, mentioned this in a speech a few months ago, didn't he, in front of an awful lot of these international institutions as well. You mentioned about the private organisations, the banks that are owed money by a lot of African countries, but China is also a big lender to many nations, isn't it? How is China responding to calls for debt forgiveness? Because in the case of Zambia, the United States was concerned that China wasn't budging at all.
Yeah, China is definitely one of Africa's creditors. Commentators are arguing that the reason why China is not budging is that China feels that the private creditors who enjoyed risk premiums, people paid them much more because Africa was considered risky, are now lining up to basically benefit from debt restructuring. And I think China wants them also to pay up. So it is a case of our creditors basically sitting on their hands and looking at each other to make sure that they do not get shortchanged when there's debt restructuring.
Now
And this
we've
is why we are talking about the entire architecture. So
and
we are not
yeah.
singling out any one creditor.
Well, we are seeing attempts to reform some economies in Africa, aren't we, to make them more sustainable, I suppose, particularly in Kenya and in Nigeria. And in the latter, in Nigeria, it's led to a much worsening of the cost of living crisis there and a bit of a backlash against the policies aimed at reforming the economy. So is there a danger here as countries try to get out of this kind of debt trap that you were talking about before?
Definitely, we cannot get out of debt by using austerity measures because they've been proved over 40 years not to work. They actually they reduce the opportunity for growth. They miserate populations. They create huge social crises. And so the answer is not in more austerity. It is in taking care of business, doing the things that are able to grow economies and to make lives better for people and not put our creditors first. Because in any case, given the high interest rates on credit, they've already earned over and over again what it was that was borrowed from them. So a more just international financial order would put them in the queue. It would not say that people should service their debt first and foremost, such that countries are using over 50% of their revenues to service debt in any year. That's
Thanks.
unconscionable.
Thanks
And
so
we,
much.
we, we, we have
Thanks.
to do something about
A more
that.
just financial order you're calling for there. Thanks very much indeed, Professor Georgie Sakata there from SOAS, University of London, one of the participants at that conference in Ghana.
Now, Africa's debt has increased sharply in recent years. The region's debt to GDP ratio has already doubled to 60% in the last decade, and it could rise 10 percentage points in the next 5 years if its fiscal trajectory doesn't change. And that's according to a report by the International Monetary Fund. Well, delegates are meeting at a conference in Accra in Ghana this week to try and work out solutions to the debt crisis. Charles Abugre is one of the main organisers of the conference, and earlier I asked him why debt levels for some African countries are becoming unmanageable.
I think they've been building up this debt gradually over the last decade, but it became really bad after COVID-19. COVID-19 disrupted the exports. In the last decade also, their main source of export earnings, which is really commodities, also started to decline when China became less and less a major consumer of commodities. So price went down. But also, Africa also had taken up this commitment to rapidly increase the construction of infrastructure, roads, electricity. So they then started to borrow with commercial private investors.
That type of borrowing is very different then to what it was in the 70s and 80s when you were borrowing from countries as opposed to companies, private companies.
Yes, that level of borrowing is completely different. The private companies, the duration of the debt was very short. So it's mainly 3-5 years duration. And the interest rates were far higher than they were when they were borrowing from governments and international financial institutions. So the debt became very expensive. And the cost of servicing the debt became onerous. There are about 20 countries at the moment who are either defaulting or at a very high risk of defaulting.
So your conference that you've organised this week is coming up with solutions to how countries can start to untangle themselves from this debt. What sort of solutions have you come up with?
First, small countries, poor countries in Africa are really not yet up for private commercial debt. And they really should be looking more at borrowing from their domestic markets and in domestic local currencies to deal with their development problems and reduce any appetite for commercial market debt. That's the first one. The second one, of course, is a governance issue, which is the discipline responsibility of governments and the levels of corruption and expenditure and waste that happens. The third, of course, is for them to take steps to deal with a better sharing of the benefits of natural resources. So They are all, giving up their gold and their diamond and their lithium, getting very little out of it. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Finally, because they have to restructure their debt at the moment, they still must manage the current debt crisis. That means the IMF has to act a little bit differently. So the conversations in Accra is about what is wrong with the way the IMF deals with debt and debt sustainability. What could they do differently, which is still consistent with the articles of their creation?
Because the IMF have recently, haven't they, asked some countries to stop costly fuel subsidies, to great disturbances in Nigeria where there have been protests over that. You'd suggest that the IMF need to relook at the way that they help countries in the global south.
Yes, so they're asking for the reduction of fuel subsidies, but given the nature of governance in Nigeria, fuel subsidies is the only way in which ordinary people have any access to benefits from the large amounts of petroleum that is exported. So the IMF should find different ways to ask them to raise money rather than to penalize ordinary people and ordinary consumers. That kind of prescription needs to be taken care of. But it's more than that. It is that the IMF has a responsibility to bring together both debtors and creditors. Prescriptions cannot always be only about debtors bearing all the responsibilities in order for creditors to minimize their losses.
Are you optimistic about the future?
I am optimistic, partly because, for example, as you can see, we are having the meeting at the time that Senegal has had a very remarkable change in leadership. Even the coups in Mali and Chad, we've seen the Malian and Chadian governments renegotiate their mineral contracts, and they are getting significant increases in revenues. So it does show that it is possible to address the revenue question without increasing dependency. And the conference seeks to make some very technical but practical proposals to the IMF. And the quality of the people around the table is such that I have no doubt that their contribution and their proposals will be reasonable, useful, and become a basis for a serious conversation with the IMF leadership.
Economist and special advisor on South-South cooperation and development finance at the South Center in Geneva, Yufin Lee, has urged resource-rich African countries to demand that multinational companies fulfill their tax obligations. Taxes from minerals and cocoa are significant revenue sources for African governments. Lee made these remarks during the inaugural International Conference on African Debt Crisis and the Reform of the International Financial Architecture in Accra.
Many multinationals, they avoid paying taxes, and they are getting a lot out of the African continent, especially from the extractive industries and even from cocoa. That's one thing, because this is very much related to the level of revenue of African countries to enable them to service and raise debt.
Lee also emphasized the importance of African countries collaborating, sharing tax collection experiences, and crafting regulations to bolster revenue mobilization efforts.
We need international cooperation on taxation issues because for transnationals, there are problems like transfer pricing, and also there are problems of not being taxed at all. So I think the developing countries should really cooperate and work together, exchange their experience relating to taxation collection, and also formulating necessary important regulations so that the collection of tax can be materialized. Another very important issue is don't monopolize technology, because multinationals really do not want to transfer technology to allow African countries to have more value added from their production, from their exports. So the African countries, many of them are still locked to the position of being raw material exporters.